Hello and welcome back. My name is Dr. Christopher Gennari. This is the Great Big History Podcast, and in this episode, we talk about the Hebrews and geography. So the Hebrews. The Hebrews are a Canaanite people on the move during the Bronze Age collapse. They're Canaanite-speaking people who are going to end up in Canaan. Kind of ironic there, I suppose. But they are a people on the move. We don't have a historical record of them in Mesopotamia before the Bronze Age collapse. Everything before that is mythological, legendary. They are one of these people on the move looking for a homeland. And we know this because we have the Moses story, which is a legendary story about the Canaanite-speaking people on the move looking for a homeland. Like, they remember when they don't write that story down. They don't write the story of Moses down when Moses happens. It's a legendary story written 1,500 years later. Or 500 years later, because the Moses story takes place somewhere around 1200 BC. It takes place at the Bronze Age collapse, somewhere around 1200, 1100 BC. It's not written down to 500 BC. It's a memory. It's not history. It's like the beginning of Lord of the Rings, where the prologue, the narrator in the Fellowship of the Ring says, and history became legend and legend became myth. And that's what we're talking about. They were one of these people on the move searching for a homeland. And they remember being homeless and being on the move and looking for a homeland. And suddenly that 40 years in the desert doesn't sound ridiculous. They just weren't in the desert. But they were on the move without any settled place to be. And lots of people were like that. And so suddenly that considering the Bronze Age collapse, goes on for about 200 years, give or take. 300 years before everyone settles down. 30 years, 40 years is nothing if you're looking for a homeland. So suddenly those numbers start to make sense when seen in a different perspective. So where do they settle? They settle between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. And Mediterranean is spelled Mediterranean. Mediterranean. They are smushed between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. So there's not a lot of land there. Few miles at its narrowest point. They are east of Egypt and southwest of Babylon. They are east of Egypt on the other side of the Sinai Desert, and they are southwest of Babylon down what we call the Levant, down the coast. So up the river and down the coast. This is a good place to be because it's east of Egypt. It is east of Egypt and southwest of Babylon. It's not near either one. The Egyptian king wants to beat you up, he's got to cross the desert. The Babylonian king wants to beat you up, he's got to go all the way up the Euphrates, come down the coast to beat you up. So that's great. So as long as Egypt and Babylon are doing their own thing, you're great. It is between these two big empires, not near either one. It is a wonderful place to be. Right up to the point where Egypt and Babylon get into wars against each other. And then you're right in the middle of Egypt and Babylon. You're in a terrible spot. And the Egyptians and the Babylonians are going to fight several battles in the homeland of the Hebrews. And there's not much the Hebrews can do to stop it. The Hebrews are the first rest stop for the Egyptians after the desert. So the Egyptians are like, let's go invade Mesopotamia. We got to cross the desert. So we'll cross the desert and first rest stop. The Hebrews. Israel, Judea. Well, I guess we're going to stop. Because if you're in Pennsylvania and you're on Pennsylvania Turnpike and you see that sign, last rest stop for 200 miles, what do? You stop. You eat something, you pee, you buy something. And if you see the sign, first rest stop after 200 miles, you stop. And you eat something, and you pee, and maybe you buy something. And that's the Hebrews. So, advantage, not near either of the two major powers. Disadvantage, right in the middle of the two big major powers. The Hebrews are not a major power. The Hebrews are the first peoples we're going to talk about who are small, who are medium-sized, who are weak compared to the big boys of Babylon and Egypt. They simply cannot compete militarily, economically. This desire, though, to be away from the big stage is seen in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is not a port. Now, this fact is going to freak out crusaders. Crusaders on their way to Jerusalem are going to get into boats in Italy and say, take us to Jerusalem. And they say, great, no problem. And they take them to Lebanon, 100, 200 miles north. And they drop them off and they say, we're in Tripoli, we're in the three cities, we're in Lebanon. Jerusalem is 100 miles that way, across the desert. And the Crusaders get mad. They're like, dude, we paid you to take us to Jerusalem. Why are we here 100 miles away? And they're like, dude, we did take you to Jerusalem. Jerusalem is nowhere near the ocean. We can't get you closer. And the Crusaders go, wait, are you people insane? Every city, every awesome city, Venice, Genoa, London, Paris, you could get to by boat. All the big cities, Cologne, in Germany, you can get to by boat. You take the ocean to a big old river and you're there. What are you talking about? Jerusalem is in a port. There's no way to get there. And they go, I don't know. It's not a port. Look at the map. You can't get there. And so Jerusalem is not a port. It lacks connections, which means it lacks connections to more developed, more significant, richer people, which means there's less trade. They are less involved. It's hard to get to Jerusalem. It's hard to get to the Hebrews, which means people and their crazy ideas are very slow in getting to the Hebrews. So advantage. They're away from people. They can stay to their own. Their culture stays relatively intact. They're not overwhelmed by Egypt to their west. And they're not overwhelmed by the sheer cultural size of Babylon and Mesopotamia. They can do their own thing. The disadvantage is they're going to be poor and they're going to be behind. And all you have to do is look to their north, to those cities of Lebanon, to Phoenicia, to see just how behind and poor the Hebrews are. The Hebrews are always looking at the Phoenicians and going, wow, look at how rich you guys are. And the Phoenicians are like, well, we're involved in trade, man. We're involved. We're going all over the place. We're trading, and we're inventing the alphabet, and we're writing, and we're trading with Egypt, and we're trading with Babylon. But if you think we're cool, you got to go to Babylon, man. They're really advanced. They're Silicon Valley. To our like Seattle, Portland, to your like Mississippi, Alabama. So the advantage is you stay together, you stay whole. Your culture isn't destroyed by these huge cultures right surrounding you. The disadvantage is that you're behind. You're poor. You're not as significant. You're not as tough as the people around you. You're not as jacked into world trade. You're not as jacked into the cutting edge of education and knowledge and stories. The disadvantage is you're behind. And so what we get is a Hebrew culture that is an interesting mix, a weird mix in the Mesopotamian world, in the Middle East, because it is clearly a Mesopotamian culture with Babylonian influences. They speak a Semitic language, which is why when someone's anti-Jewish today, they're called anti-Semitic. They're speaking a Mesopotamian language. They are part of a Mesopotamian language group. It's them and Arabic are the only Semitic languages to survive. But that is Mesopotamian. So they're going to have Babylonian influences, especially after the 586 Babylonian captivity, where Nebuchadnezzar comes, sacks the city, burns down Jerusalem, picks up the people and moves them to Babylon. You're going to get them picking up Babylonian law, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, temple design, language. They're going to start to write down these stories that they have. They're going to take Gilgamesh and say, you know, that one guy who's not dead who built the boat, he's our guy. They're going to take these Babylonian influences. And you see them all over the Old Testament. They're all over. Now, Babylon is simultaneously awesome and horrible, because it is awesome because it's advanced, and it's horrible because it's decadent. Think Las Vegas. But Hebrew architecture, Hebrew law, Hebrew writing is all going to pull from Babylon. But they're going to have a tight political alliance with Egypt. Egypt, the king of Egypt, the pharaoh of Egypt, is right to the west. He's the closest big dog on the block. And so the idea was, if we want protection, we have to ally with the king of Egypt. He will protect us because we are the last stop. Like if someone takes us over, they are going to invade Egypt. So it is in the Egyptian pharaoh's goal to protect the Hebrews, to let the Hebrews be independent and protected rather than be conquered by a Asia Minor or Babylonian king. Now, that requires the Egyptian king to come across a desert to come and save the Hebrews if they get attacked by a Phoenician, a Hittite, or a Babylonian king. If the Pharaoh doesn't do that, tough noogies, it's not going to work. But that's the idea. So you have a Mesopotamian culture. The Hebrews are clearly tied culturally, in their language, in their thought, to Babylon, to Mesopotamia. But politically and militarily, they are tied to Egypt. And 3, they are separated from other Canaanite peoples. They are clearly saying to everybody else, we are different from you people. We are different from the Phoenicians, but we are also different from other Canaanites. They're not the only people. You know this if you know your Moses story. The Moses story ends with Moses dying, not in the land of milk and honey, not having reached Canaan. That's going to be led by Joshua. So Joshua comes down the mountain with an army, with his people, into the land of Canaan. And what does he find? Canaanites. Other people who speak similar language to him, but are clearly politically different. And what he does is then begin a series of wars that continue through David and Solomon to unite with and or kick out these Canaanite peoples. So eventually, under David and under Solomon, the Hebrews will become the dominant Canaanite people. But that takes a couple of hundred years. And in the meantime, they are clearly telling the world we're different. Their diet is different. Hebrews are not going to eat pork. Now, I'm going to ask why. And the answer is always going to be pigs are dirty. And no, they're not. They're not. They're no dirtier than any other animal. You think chickens aren't dirty? Have you seen chickens? Have you been to a chicken farm? Turkeys? Cows? The pig is no different than any of these other animals that you guys eat without even thinking about it. And you guys eat pork. If you're not Jewish, you eat pork a lot. You eat bacon and you don't go, oh, this pig was dirty. No. So why not eat pork? Why is there a rule against it? And the answer is because pork was the first domesticated meat. Pigs were the meat protein source in the Middle East for urban peoples. Everybody ate pork. Everybody ate bacon. Everybody had pork chops. Everybody. We're going to see this again when we talk about Christianity and the Romans. Paul goes to the Greeks and he goes to the Romans and he says, okay, I've got a great God, Jesus, and you should really follow him. And people go, great, what do we have to do? And he says, not eat pork. And they all go, yeah, no, I'm going to keep Zeus, thank you very much. Because everybody ate pork. So by saying, we're not going to eat pork, is to say, we are different than you. Circumcision is the same thing. When boys are born, now, if you're an American, you might not know this. You might not know you're circumcised. But if you're a white boy, you are circumcised. You are like 99% likely to have been circumcised. If you are an African American, it's something like 85% of African American men are circumcised. And if you're Hispanic, you're 50%. And that 50% is really a divide on how recently your family or you are an immigrant. If you're a recent or first generation, you're probably not circumcised. If you are, if you're one of those Mexican families in Texas who's been here 400 years, you're circumcised. Because circumcision became an American thing, a British and American thing in the early 1900s about hygiene. And so American men are circumcised. But you may not know that a baby, when a baby boy is born, he's got a bippy on his bippy. He's got a turtleneck. He's got a turtleneck. He's got a sheath for his bippy. Well, the Hebrews go, you know what we can do with that? Cut that off. Nobody else does this. Nobody else in the Mesopotamian world does this. Now, the Christians later won't because they're Roman. And they'll go, cut the bippy off my bippy. Are you crazy? No, I'm not doing that. But the Arabs will. The Arabs are circumcised people, whereas Christians are not. But the idea of circumcision is we're special. Now, the religious reason is it's a sacrifice to our God, but it's to say we're different. Because you look at a circumcised man and go, hey, you're one of me. I'm circumcised, you're circumcised. We're Hebrews, woo! No matter where you are in the world. In fact, so part of the identity of being a Jewish man is circumcision that during World War II, it's one way Nazis found Jews. A guy said, no, I'm German. Look, I'm speaking German. Well, I'm a German citizen. I'm totally German. I'm not Jewish at all. They said, drop your pants. And he said, shit. Because he was circumcised. And that was the end of that. Because German Christians weren't circumcised. So it was a way of separating you out from the other people. And finally, religion, which we're going to talk a lot about. They're going to have one God. They're going to go through a series. They're going to start with polytheism. They're going to go to what's called monolatry, Monoltry, monolatry. You see this in Moses, where there are lots of gods, but we only worship one. Like the Egyptians have gods, and the Babylonians have gods, but we have the right God. To monotheism, mono, M-O-N-O, T-H-E-ism, where there is only one God, and the Egyptians are worshiping smoke, and the Babylonians are worshiping their imagination. Like, there's only one God that exists, and everybody else is not only wrong, they're delusional. That's monotheism. And so that's going to separate them as well, because everybody's polytheist. Because you need multiple gods to help you out, to control nature for you. So in these ways, in their diet, in their circumcision, in their religion of monolatry and then monotheism, it is going to show that they are different from everybody else. And that makes total sense. You have to understand that that makes total sense. Because if they don't do that, if they act just like everybody else, they disappear. They'll be absorbed into Babylon. They'll be absorbed into Mesopotamian culture. They'll become Phoenician, because these other places are better, are richer, are more advanced. There's no reason to be a Canaanite Hebrew. If you speak just like everybody else, if you act just like everybody else, if you worship a god or worship multiple gods just like everybody else, or if you worship other people's gods, you would disappear. They would be absorbed and they wouldn't exist anymore. And Judaism wouldn't exist, Christianity wouldn't exist, and Islam wouldn't exist. And we see this with the destruction of Israel by the Assyrians, who pick up the 10 tribes, the vast majority, something like 80% of all Hebrews, and scatter them to the winds, and they're gone. They absorbed into the Assyrian Empire. They become basically Mesopotamian, and they're gone. They are lost to history. There's no finding them. Like the lost army of Cambyses. They are gone. Like Roanoke. They are gone. And so it's a way of protecting your culture and your people when you are small and insignificant. When you are a fish in a world of an Egyptian and a Babylonian whale. Killer whales, actually. And so in our next episode, we're going to talk about what we just talked about, religion, polytheism, monolatry, and monotheism. And we're going to talk about how those things work. And then we are going to move on to explaining monotheism, because that's eventually, after 586, where Judaism will end up and why it's important. And so that's what we will do next. Thank you very much.